I want to thank Cheryl Wallace for inviting me to share my grandfather's story, and Rabbi Pardo for introducing me to the Chambersburg community, as well as those of you who are from other areas who joined us. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm not the standard speaker for a Holocaust memorial or Yom HaShoah service. I did not grow up hearing stories of my European ancestors or knowing survivors at first hand. As a matter of fact, I didn't meet a Holocaust survivor until I was 18 years old and started investigating these kinds of things. In fact, I didn't grow up Jewish, but I converted as an adult. However, I was able to pass on to my three daughters, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, an appreciation for the sacrifices made during that time by Jewish and non-Jewish families. When they were growing up, we were not able to share in the lighting of memorial candles at this time of year. We were, however, as a family, able to stand with those who had participated in the liberation of the Nazi death camps. My grandfather, Staff Sergeant Samuel A. Hernandez, was a liberator at Dachau. I'm deeply grateful for the example my grandfather lived, for the sacrifice he was willing to make, and for his decision to share with me experiences during the war, experiences that he had not shared with others, including his oldest daughter, my mom, Cassandra, who is on the call with us today. I cannot quantify the impact my grandfather had on me that has shaped me as the person I am today. I know, however, without a doubt, that his experience as an American soldier and a liberator of Jewish victims of the Holocaust have imbued me with values and perspective I may not have otherwise known. My grandfather grew up in Long Beach, California. His mother immigrated from Mexico with his brother and sister in 1925, just months before he was born. Fast forward to mid-December 1941, 16-year-old Sam is begging his mother to sign the permission form to let him join the Army Air Corps. She said no. Sitting out the war in high school was not my grandfather's idea of a good time. So as soon as he turned 17 in 1942, he enlisted in the civil service and drove a half-ton pickup truck. 1 year later, at the age of 18, and without finishing high school, he was inducted into the United States Army on the 10th of January, 1944. After basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and advanced training at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, my grandfather married his sweetheart, Lucille, who had been working and waiting for him at Fort Smith. And let's see if I can show you this photo. Yes, this is their wedding picture, 1944. Having fought with the 4th and 16th Armored Division units through Italy and Austria, Sam found himself in Germany during the early days of 1945. At some point, Corporal Hernandez became separated from his unit and teamed up with a group from the 20th Armored Division. As recorded by officers and reporters on the ground on the 29th of April, 1945, both the 45th Thunderbird Division and 42nd Rainbow Divisions were advancing toward Munich with the 20th Armored Division between them. Dachau was directly in their path, about 10 miles north of Munich. The 101st Tank Battalion was attached to the 45th Thunderbird Division. According to this source, the 101st arrived in the town of Dachau at 9:30 a.m. on April 29th. According to Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the commander of the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Thunderbird Division, he received orders at 10:15 a.m. to liberate the Dachau camp, and the soldiers of I Company were first to arrive at the camp around 11 a.m. on that day. Naren Egan, a Turkish journalist who was a prisoner at Dachau, wrote that, quote, the Americans were not simply advancing, they were running, flying, breaking all the rules of military conduct, mounting their pieces on captured trucks using tractors, bicycles, carts, trailers, anything on wheels they could get their hands on. The 2nd Battalion, 222nd Regiment, 42nd Division was coming brazenly, impudently, down the highway, its general in the lead. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Fellens, the 42nd Infantry Division of the U.S. 7th Army, wrote in his memoir that 700 yards inside the main gate, we encountered the concentration enclosure itself. There before us, behind an electrically charged barbed wire fence, stood a mass of cheering, half-mad men, women, and children, waving and shouting with happiness. Their liberators had come. The noise was beyond comprehension. Every individual, over 32,000, who could utter a sound was cheering. Our hearts, he wrote, wept as we saw the tears of happiness fall from their cheeks. Regarding the train outside the camp, Michael W. Perry wrote the following in his editor's preface to the official report by the United States 7th Army. For many of the soldiers who stumbled into camp that day, their first glimpse into its horrors came as they walked along a rail spur outside the camp. Cramped into railroad cars and scattered along the tracks were the bodies of men who had been alive when they had begun the long journey, during which their captors fully expected them to die of thirst and starvation. At the end of that journey, Dachau's crematory stood eerily waiting. My grandfather arrived later that afternoon. He told me that he and his buddies were shocked by what they saw. They could not speak. Most wept. They had seen and done horrible things since their arrival in Europe. But this, he could not put words into what he saw. But he told me what they did. Against the orders they received earlier in the day, every man emptied his pack. They gave food, water, clothing. Some took off their shirts. They took out their tools, their cigarettes, anything useful to give to the former prisoners at Dachau. They set up their own form of triage to get specific and appropriate supplies to those who needed them most. Not only were they shocked and moved to compassion, they were angry. The stories they had heard, but did not want to believe, were true. The United States government knew what was happening. The Red Cross knew what was happening. Their own senior commanders knew what was happening. Why did it take so long to do something? As these 18, 19, and 20-year-old American soldiers were trying desperately to immediately improve the lives of these men, women, and children, and not all of them would survive the day, they heard a new convoy of trucks approach the camp. One was a Red Cross truck. Their hopes grew that someone had thought through the situation and medical and food supplies would be on their way shortly. Men wearing the uniform of the International Red Cross got out of the truck and set up tables. Corporal Hernandez watched in disgust as he saw them place on those tables coffee dispensers and donuts for newly liberated prisoners, most of whom were malnourished, all of whom needed water and real solid food. Not all of the American soldiers were looking after the immediate needs of the now classified displaced persons. It was too much for some of these young men to process and respond with compassion toward the victims. Rather, they were already seeking revenge on the Nazi captors. Most SS and other Nazi soldiers did not survive that day in Dachau. While the actions of these men are not excusable under the Geneva Convention, they are certainly understandable. According to Marcus J. Smith, a doctor who treated these displaced persons, in January 1945, there were 2,888 deaths at Dachau, 3,977 deaths in February. By the time the American liberators reached the Dachau camp, there was no more coal left to stoke the crematory, and bodies had been left lying on the ground. Hugh Carlton Green, a journalist with the BBC, reported that there were more than 2,000 corpses lying on the ground inside the camp in various stages of decay. He said that he witnessed some of the US soldiers vomiting. I remember that from a very young age, my grandfather would tell me I should always do what I know is the right thing to do, even if others tell me differently. I know he learned this lesson in a very real way at Dachau. He obeyed neither the orders of the officers in charge, nor those who would strike an easy revenge. He did the hard thing and gave of himself to those who were most vulnerable. At some point, Corporal Hernandez did have a run-in with a German officer. He did not tell me the details, but I have today in my possession the Czech 9mm pistol that my grandfather took from that officer. Corporal Hernandez went on to NCO school, non-commissioned officer school, and was promoted to sergeant and then staff sergeant. He served with distinction, earning the Bronze Star. Although offered a field promotion to second lieutenant, he turned it down. His CO placed him in command of a military police unit anyway, where he excelled at arresting and prosecuting American and Allied officers for smuggling contraband. And I have also a photo, let's see if I can bring that up, of my grandfather as he was commanding that unit. There he is. You can imagine this young man, 20 years old, arresting American officers and then getting convictions. He had a number of commendations as well as complaints by very high-ranking officers. There are other terrific stories I could tell you about my grandfather during his time in Europe, like when he volunteered to repatriate some American supplies that the Russian army mistakenly took behind their lines. But it was his experience at Dachau, which I believe made him the man, the father, the grandfather, the friend, the manager that he was. In 1983, I had the opportunity to visit Germany and Austria, meeting some of the people my grandfather served with during the war. They treated me like royalty, which was actually a statement of how they thought of my grandfather. He wrote me a letter shortly before I left for that trip, offering some advice. I believe the closing words in this letter encapsulate what he had learned 38 years earlier. Remember, he wrote, it's not the material things that are important. They are necessary. What is important is that which is free. Love and caring for one another. That is the hardest thing for people to understand. You cannot buy it. You have to give it of yourself. Be careful. Do as you are asked. Be yourself. I want to bless you, and I ask you to bless me, that God should help us see clearly in what seem to be impossible situations to give of ourselves. Thank you. Oh, also, I want to show you a picture, the last picture that I have of my grandfather and I. There's us in 1999. Thank you very much.
Thank